My husband's yacht pulled out of Battery Point Marina in the early morning fog. With my father's name still painted on the stern in gold, and the woman standing at the railing, watching the dock shrink behind her wasn't me. I stood on the pier with my suitcase still in my hand, the first drops of rain spotting the weathered wood around my feet. Conrad hadn't looked back once. Not when he untied from the slip. Not when the engine turned over. Not when Darcy, the VP of Revenue Strategy he'd hired without consulting me, the woman I had once shaken hands with across a conference table, and called a good addition to the team, draped herself over the railing like she belonged there. He expected me to call after him, to run down the pier, to beg. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed the charter terminal at Charleston Executive Airport. I had a plan, a thorough one, and my husband had no idea it was already in motion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My story doesn't start on that dock. It starts 8 months earlier, in a hospital room in Savannah, with my father's hand in mine, and a company I wasn't sure I was ready to run. Dad built Marsh Hospitality Group, from one converted Victorian bed and breakfast in Beaufort, South Carolina. By the time I finished college, he had 14 boutique hotels along the southeast coast, each one chosen the way certain people choose a home. For bones, for character, for the kind of quiet dignity that doesn't need to shout. He had a gift for seeing what a place could become. He also had an instinct for people that I've spent the better part of my adult life wishing I'd inherited more completely. He was 67 when the pancreatic cancer was diagnosed. 6 weeks from that conversation to the end. I held his hand through the last night. My mother had passed when I was 19, so it was just us. Just the two of us in that room with the machines humming and the antiseptic smell, and 40 years of everything we'd never quite figured out how to say. He squeezed my fingers twice before the monitor went flat. I've thought about those 2 squeezes more times than I can count. I'm still not sure what they meant. I hope it was something like, "You're going to be okay." The morning after the service, I sat across from our family attorney in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and leather. Dad had left everything to me. The hotels, the properties, the holding company. Full ownership of Marsh Hospitality Group, valued just north of $60 million. Douglas Fenn looked at me over his reading glasses with the careful expression of a man handing someone a heavier object than they'd expected. "Your father was very specific," he said. "Direct bloodline. He didn't want the structure complicated." Conrad was beside me. He'd driven us to the meeting, kept my coffee warm, handled the parking. He squeezed my knee under the table when Douglas read the valuation. When I looked at him, his eyes were wet. I thought it was grief. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. Conrad and I had been married 6 years. We met at an industry conference in Atlanta. He was consulting for a small boutique property in Asheville. I was presenting on sustainable hospitality practices for my father's company. He'd laughed at something I said about occupancy metrics and I'd thought, there it is. That easy kind of recognition. We were married 18 months later. After the funeral, my husband was everything. He fielded condolence calls. He coordinated with the estate attorney. He made sure the hotels kept operating, while I couldn't get out of bed before noon. He took a leave from his own consulting work without being asked. "You don't have to figure all of this out right now," he told me one evening. We were on the back porch of the Savannah house with 2 glasses of wine, watching the marsh go dark at the edges. "But when you're ready, I'm here. Whatever you need." He seemed so present, so genuinely steady. I almost missed the way his posture shifted when he said it. Something almost imperceptible. A tightening, a waiting. Almost. 6 weeks after Dad died, my husband suggested he come on board formally. Chief Operating Officer. He'd handle the day-to-day operations, the vendor relationships, the staff management, everything that was pulling me away from what I was actually good at, which was the vision side, the creative direction, the things that had made Marsh Hospitality what it was. It would free me to do what Dad had always said I did best. I hesitated. My father had never offered Conrad a position in the company, despite years of opportunity to do so. He'd said once, almost in passing, that he thought my husband was better suited to working for himself. I hadn't asked him to elaborate. I've thought about that sentence almost every day since. But I was 39 years old, and newly orphaned, and running a $60 million hospitality group on 4 hours of sleep a night. And the man I'd spent 6 years building a life with was standing in front of me offering to help carry the weight. So I said yes. I also, and this is the part I've had to forgive myself for slowly, had Douglas draft an equity arrangement, 20% of the holding company as deferred compensation, formalized as part of the COO agreement. It was my idea. My husband never asked for it directly, he was too careful for that. Douglas prepared the paperwork with the same look he'd had in the reading. Measured, deliberate. "You're certain about this?" he asked. "He's my husband," I said. "We're building something together." The first months were convincing. Conrad visited the properties, met the general managers, learned every vendor relationship my father had cultivated over 3 decades. The staff liked him immediately. He had the kind of ease that makes people feel attended to, and he remembered everyone's name. I was deep in a renovation project at our Savannah property, and genuinely grateful to have someone managing the operational side. We fell asleep over laptops, and woke up talking about revenue projections. For a while it felt like partnership. Looking back, I can identify almost exactly when it stopped being that. It started with a meeting I wasn't invited to. I arrived at the corporate office one Tuesday morning to find Conrad already in the conference room with our regional managers and a woman I didn't recognize. He introduced her after the fact as Darcy Walsh. She'd come from a resort group in Florida, highly recommended, a specialist in revenue strategy. He'd brought her on as VP of Revenue. He hadn't mentioned it to me beforehand. I pulled him aside afterward. "VP-level positions aren't routine hires," I said. He apologized. Sincerely, I thought. He brought flowers home that night. Not the gas station kind, properly arranged. The pale yellow ranunculus I'd told him once were my favorite. And we talked for an hour about communication and what it meant to run something together. By the end of the conversation I'd almost convinced myself I was overreacting. I was not overreacting. Over the following weeks, Darcy was always nearby. Sitting beside my husband in meetings I'd call in late to. Joining calls I hadn't been looped into. Once, walking past his office, I caught the two of them laughing at something on his laptop screen. The unguarded kind of laugh you share with someone you've known a long time and are completely comfortable with. I found a hotel folio 3 weeks later, tucked into the inside pocket of a blazer he'd set on the chair in the bedroom to take to the dry cleaner. 2 rooms billed to the same reservation, at a resort in Boca Raton. The conference he'd attended for industry networking. The second room was billed to Darcy Walsh. I sat in the car in the garage for a long time. When I asked him, he didn't deny it right away. That pause, that half-second of calculation, is what I remember most clearly. "It was a mistake," he said finally. "Once I ended it." I wanted to believe him. 6 years of marriage. The memory of who we'd been at the beginning. The man who'd sat beside me while my father died and hadn't flinched once. I held on to all of it. We started seeing a therapist. Dr. Okafor had a calm, precise manner and a white noise machine outside her office door. In those sessions, my husband was attentive. He talked about grief and ambition and the difficulty of stepping into a supporting role after years of running his own work. He made it sound like a journey he was committed to. I believed him. For about 3 weeks. I came home early one afternoon to find his home office door slightly ajar. I stopped with my hand raised to knock. "She's focused on the renovation," he was saying. Low voice, the particular register of someone trying not to carry. "By the time she's looking at the bigger picture, it'll already be in place." I stood there for a long time after he hung up. That night I pulled up the company's financial accounts. What I found was methodical. Small transfers at first, then larger ones, routed through an LLC I'd never seen the paperwork for. He'd established it using a company signatory authorization. He wasn't empowered to activate without my co-signature. He'd also been in correspondence with an acquisition group called Beacon Resorts International. Not about a partnership, but about a full buyout of Marsh Hospitality. Their plan was to absorb the properties into their national portfolio and rebrand everything. 40 years of my father's work. Renamed, standardized, unrecognizable. The worst thing I found was a folder on the company's shared drive. My husband had titled it, Organizational Restructuring Phase 2. Inside was a document prepared for Beacon's leadership team. It outlined 3 scenarios for what he called the transition of legacy management. Each one was a different method of removing me from my own company. The preferred option was labeled cleanly: voluntary exit facilitated through Nassau Summit. The Nassau Summit. 4 days of hospitality industry meetings in the Bahamas. My husband had suggested 2 weeks prior that we combine it with a trip on the yacht. Take the boat down from Charleston, spend a few days on the water before the conference. A second honeymoon, he'd called it. A chance to reconnect. I'd thought he was trying. I'd let myself be moved by the gesture. Now I understood what the marina was really for. I called Marguerite O.C. the next morning from my car, parked 2 blocks from the office. I'd worked with Marguerite years before when she'd handled a contract dispute for my father. She was the kind of attorney who didn't need to raise her voice, because her precision was the most quietly devastating thing in any room she entered. She'd since built a corporate law practice that specialized in exactly this kind of situation. She picked up on the second ring. I talked for 20 minutes. She listened without a single interruption. "Send me everything tonight," she said when I finished. "All of it. I'll be through it by morning. We leave for Nassau in 4 days. A pause. Then go. Keep your passport on your person at all times. And Helena, does he know you've found this?" "No." "Good. Keep it that way." I spent the next 4 days being a convincing wife. It required more than I'd expected. My husband was attentive in the way of someone who has already decided how a situation ends, and is simply performing his part until it does. He carried my bag to the car the morning we left, asked twice if I'd eaten, held my hand on the drive down to the harbor. At the marina, he went to check in with the dock office. I stood beside the yacht and looked out at the channel. The sky was low and gray, and the air smelled like rain, coming off the ocean. That's when I saw the silver car pull in. She got out in a white sundress, with a weekender bag over her shoulder. And she walked straight to my husband like she'd done it 100 times, which I suppose she had. He stepped out of the dock office and met her, without looking toward where I was standing. I watched them together for a moment. Then he looked up and saw me. His expression didn't collapse. It went very still, very controlled, and I understood in that moment that he'd already made the calculation. He no longer needed the performance. He walked toward me, while she took her bag aboard. "Darcy is joining us for Nassau," he said, flat, businesslike. "Beacon's team requested her for the presentation." "There isn't going to be a presentation," I said. Something moved in his jaw. "Helena, this deal is going to move forward regardless of how comfortable you are with it. There is no action without my signature, and I haven't signed anything." He studied me for a moment. Then he tried the other approach, the reasonable one, the voice he'd used in Dr. Okafor's office. "Come on board. We'll talk it through on the water. That's the sensible thing to do." I picked up my bag. "I'll pass," I said. He stood there, recalculating. Then he turned and walked up the gangway without another word. The engine turned over. The Albert M moved slowly out of its slip. My father's name in gold letters on the stern, catching the flat gray light. I watched it go. Hank Trowbridge, the harbor master, found me at the end of the main pier about 10 minutes later. He'd known my father for 30 years. He had a thermos of coffee, and the expression of a man who'd seen some of what had happened, and wasn't sure what to say about it. "Come inside," he said, "before it rains for real." We sat in his office with the harbor radio playing quietly, and I drank his terrible coffee. And he didn't ask me anything for a while. Then he said simply, "Your dad knew good people from bad ones better than anybody I ever met." "I know," I said. I should have listened to what he was telling me. Hank looked at his hands. "What do you need?" "A charter flight to Nassau," I said, "today if possible." He didn't hesitate. "I've got a contact at Charleston Executive, good operation. They can probably get you out by 3. I was already texting Marguerite. She was waiting at the terminal when I arrived. Dark suit, briefcase, the expression of someone who had spent 72 hours building something airtight. When she spread the documents across the lounge table, I saw for the first time how solid our position actually was. The LLC was fraudulent, established using a signatory authorization. My husband wasn't empowered to invoke without my co-signature. Every transfer had left a clean, traceable record. The Beacon correspondence had been conducted using Marsh Hospitality email accounts, which constitute unauthorized use of corporate communications infrastructure for personal gain, and the equity stake, the 20% I'd arranged as part of the COO agreement, was subject to a forfeiture clause embedded in the holding company's original operating agreement. Any equity granted to non-founding shareholders could be clawed back in the event of demonstrated breach of fiduciary duty. My father's attorneys had put it there 2 decades. Before I ever thought to question anything. He'd known something. He'd built the protection in quietly, the way he built everything. Without fanfare, without explanation, trusting that the structure would hold when it needed to. Judge Harmon reviewed the emergency motion this afternoon. Marguerite said as we took our seats on the charter, she granted the TRO. Asset transfers are frozen. The subsidiary account has been locked. His corporate card was deactivated at 2 p.m. He'll notice at dinner, I said. He will, she agreed. By then you'll already be in Nassau. I spent the flight signing documents and reviewing the manager notification Penny had drafted. My assistant had been with Marsh Hospitality for 11 years. She'd watched my husband's ascent with the careful silence of someone who understood the situation better than I had. And knew it wasn't her place to say so. She'd prepared everything. The staff communication. The vendor reassurances, the board summary, with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for the moment when she could finally help. Somewhere over the Florida coast, my phone showed a notification from our IT director. Conrad had attempted to access the Beacon files from the Yacht satellite connection. Access denied. I set the phone down and looked out the window at the dark water below. The yacht was down there somewhere. Moving toward the same set of coordinates I was. I got there first. The conference center was already active when Marguerite and I walked in the next morning. I'd dressed, deliberately. Navy wrap dress, my mother's gold earrings. The kind of composed that requires actual effort to assemble. Penny had confirmed the Beacon meeting was in the Coral boardroom at 10. We arrived at 9:52. The room went quiet when I pushed the door open. My husband was at the head of the table. Darcy beside him. 3 men in suits on the other side. Beacon's acquisition team, with the particular posture of people who think they're here to finalize something. Helena. My husband recovered quickly as he always did. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. I know, I said, and took the chair at the opposite end of the table. Marguerite sat beside me and opened her briefcase. The lead Beacon representative leaned forward. Mrs. Marsh, your husband has indicated that the ownership structure. My husband has been misrepresenting it, I said pleasantly. The company is currently operating under a court-ordered freeze of all assets associated with an LLC he established without proper authorization. You'll want to review this before we go any further. Marguerite distributed the copies. The Beacon team pulled inward. I could see the liability calculation happening in real time. Their lead picked up the TRO and read the first page carefully. Then he looked at my husband. My husband's jaw was very tight. This is a misunderstanding that my attorney can. The forfeiture clause in the operating agreement has been triggered. Marguerite said. Not raised. Simply stated. The 20% equity stake reverts to the founding shareholder effective as of yesterday. We have the documentation here if you'd like it. The Beacon team conferred quietly. Their lead set the papers down. I think, he said carefully, we need to pause until our counsel has reviewed the situation. Of course, I said. I stood. If Beacon has interest in a legitimate distribution arrangement in the future, I'd be glad to have that conversation. But Marsh Hospitality is not for acquisition. It wasn't when my father ran it, and it isn't now. I looked at my husband. He was watching me with something I'd never seen on his face before. Something stripped of its usual certainty. Raw in a way that might have undone me 6 months ago. It didn't undo me now. Your access to company systems and accounts has been revoked, I said. Our attorney will be in contact regarding the divorce. The Albert M is a company asset. We'll need it returned to Battery Point Marina within the week. I looked at Darcy. She hadn't spoken once. She was studying the table. HR will send your separation paperwork to your personal email, I told her. Please return your company laptop before you fly home. She nodded without looking up. Marguerite closed her briefcase. We walked out together. I sat in the hotel courtyard for a long time afterward, alone with the sound of a fountain and the distant noise of the conference pavilion. I ordered iced tea and didn't drink it. I sat with the particular feeling of something very heavy, being finally, completely set down. I thought about my father. About the forfeiture clause he'd buried in a document 20 years old. The quiet architecture of protection he'd built into the foundation, without ever explaining why. He'd always said that a well-made structure anticipates what you can't predict. He was talking about hotels. He was also talking about everything else. Penny texted at noon, board briefed, all property managers reached. Savannah GM asks if renovation timeline is still on track. I wrote back, tell her yes, and Penny thank you, for all of it. Her reply, your father trusted me to look after this company. So do you, that's enough for me. I flew home 3 days later. Drove directly from the airport to the corporate office. Parked in the spot that had always been mine, and walked through the lobby for the first time. Since everything had broken open. My father's photograph hung in the entrance, an early shot, him standing in front of the original Beaufort property. A little rumpled, grinning like he'd just realized something wonderful. I'd walked past it thousands of times without really stopping. I stood there and looked at him for a long time. I thought about what I was going to build now. What the next version of this company would be, shaped by my hands instead of borrowed from his. Smaller in some ways, maybe, while I untangled what my husband had started to dismantle. But ours. Unambiguously, completely ours. I had calls to make. Vendors to reassure, a renovation to finish. An operating structure to protect properly this time. I walked to my office, sat down, and pulled up my email. Conrad had sailed away on my father's boat. Believing he'd left me stranded on the dock with nothing. He forgot that my father spent 30 years teaching me how to read the water. And that the first thing he ever taught me was how to recognize a storm before it arrives. And what to do when it does.